Hello friends, welcome to Lost Scrolls Archive. Everyone remembers the first two brothers. Their story is one of the oldest the world has ever told, and almost everyone knows it, even people who have never opened a Bible in their lives. Two sons of the first man and the first woman, one who worked the soil, and one who kept the flocks, one whose offering was accepted, and one whose offering was not. The jealousy that grew in the rejected brother's heart, dark and patient, until it spilled out in a field where no one was watching. The first murder, the first blood soaking into the first ground. The voice of God asking, "Where is your brother?" And the cold and famous answer, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Cain and Abel, the killer and the killed. The whole tragedy of the human heart, compressed into two brothers and a field and a stone. Everyone remembers Cain and Abel. Almost no one remembers the one who came after, for the story does not end in that field. Abel lay dead, his blood crying out from the ground. Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, marked, exiled, a wanderer on the earth eastward into the land of Nod, and the first man and the first woman were left with nothing. One son murdered, one son banished. The whole bright hope of the human race that had begun in a garden, now reduced to a fresh grave, and first an empty place at the fire. They had been driven from paradise. They had buried a child. They had lost the other to his own crime. And the line of the righteous, the line through which the ancient promise was supposed to come, the promise made at the very gates of Eden, that one day a child of the woman would crush the head of the serpent, that line was in a single afternoon utterly broken. Abel was dead. Cain was a murderer. There was no one left to carry it. And then the text says, the first man and woman had another son, a third son, born out of grief, born into a world that had already learned what death was, born to replace a brother whose blood was barely dry. And the mother looked at this child this late, this unhoped for, this third child, and she gave him a name that was almost a prayer, almost a sigh of relief, almost a confession of how close the whole human story had come to ending before it began. She named him Seth. And here is the thing that the world has forgotten. Here is the thing that should make you sit up tonight and lean in. It was not from Cain that the human race descended. Cain's line, as we will see, ran for a few brilliant and violent generations, and then vanished beneath the waters, leaving nothing. And it was not from Abel, who died childless in the field, his blood his only legacy. It was from Seth, the third son, the forgotten one, the one almost no one remembers. From Seth came Enosh, and from Enosh the long line of the patriarchs. And down through that line, generation after generation, came Noah, and from Noah, every human being who survived the flood, which is to say, every human being who has ever lived since. Every nation, every people, every face you have ever seen, all of it descends not from the famous brothers, but from the forgotten one. Which means that if you are alive to hear this, if your heart is beating, if your lungs are drawing breath, then you are his child. You are the seed of Seth. The blood of that third unremembered son runs in your veins, carried down across an unimaginable gulf of years, through more generations than anyone could count, to arrive at last in you. He is your ancestor. He is everyone's ancestor, and almost no one knows his name. Tonight we are going to remember him. And as we do, we are going to uncover one of the most quietly astonishing threads in the whole of Scripture. The thread of the other seed, the line that carried the broken promise forward when everything else had failed. We will follow the great divergence of the two bloodlines, the line of Cain and the line of Seth, the one that built cities and forged weapons and sang the first songs of vengeance, and the one that did something far stranger and far quieter. Something the text describes in a single haunting sentence that we will spend a long time inside. We will walk down the long corridor of the Sethite generations with their enormous spans of years and their solemn repeating refrain, "And he died, and he died, and he died," and we will find, hidden in the middle of that corridor, the one man of whom it was never said. We will confront the great and ancient mystery of the sons of God and the daughters of men, and a reading of it that turns the whole story of Seth into a tragedy. And we will uncover the strangest legend of all, the two great pillars that the children of Seth are said to have raised against the end of the world, inscribed with all the wisdom of the ancient earth, built to outlast both flood and fire, so that knowledge itself would never wholly perish. And underneath all of it, running like a current beneath the surface of the whole story, we will find a question that is not really about the ancient world at all. It is about you. It is the question of what it means to be the quiet one, the one who is not famous, not brilliant, not remembered, the one who simply comes after and carries on. We live in a world much like the world of Cain, that worships the mark you leave, the name you make, the monument you build, the brilliance the world can see and applaud, and almost none of us will leave such a mark. Almost all of us are Seth, the ones who come after, who carry the thread a little further, who pass on what we were given, and then fade from memory. And the story of the forgotten son asks gently and insistently whether that quiet life is really the lesser thing the world tells us it is, or whether it might be, in truth, the very thing the whole human story has always depended on. That question will be with us the whole way down, and by the end, I think it will have answered itself. So settle in, let the noise of the day fall away, and let your breathing slow. If these forgotten corners of the old stories are the kind of thing that gives you rest at the end of a long day, then you might consider subscribing, so the next of these quiet journeys finds its way to you. And somewhere in the comments, if you are willing, tell us the name of someone who came before you, a grandparent, a great-grandparent, someone whose name you carry and whose blood you bear. Because this tonight is a story about exactly that, the long, unbroken thread of those who came before, and the quiet ones who kept it from breaking. And now let us go back past every name you know, back to the very beginning of the line, to a grieving mother and a fresh grave, and a third son born to carry a promise that had almost died in a field. To understand Seth, you have to understand the silence he was born into, because it was a silence shaped like grief. Think of where the human story at the moment of his birth. It had begun in a garden, in light, in the cool of the evening, when God walked among the trees. The first man and the first woman had been made in the image of their Maker, given a paradise to keep, given each other, given the whole green world, and it had all gone wrong. The fruit, the serpent, the opened eyes, the hiding among the trees, the terrible question, where are you? And the long walk out through the gates into a world of thorns and sweat and pain, the garden sealed behind them, the way back guarded by a flaming sword that turned every way. That was the first loss, paradise itself. And then came the second loss, worse than the first, because it was a loss no one had ever suffered before. Their children grew, Cain the firstborn, a worker of the ground, Abel the second, a keeper of sheep. And the day came when each brought an offering, and Abel's was accepted, and Cain's was not, and something curdled in the older brother's heart. God himself warned him, "Sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." And Cain did not rule over it. He spoke to his brother in the field, and he rose up, and he killed him. And the first man and the first woman learned what no human beings had ever had to learn before. What it is to find a child cold and still, to understand that he will not get up, that the breath that was in him is gone and is not coming back. They learned death not as an idea, not as a distant rumor, but as a body that had to be buried, a grave that had to be dug, a place in the world where a living son used to be, and now would never be again. And then came the third loss, folding grief into grief, for the son who remained was the son who had done it. Cain stood condemned before God, and the ground itself, which had drunk his brother's blood, would no longer yield its strength to him. He was made a fugitive and a wanderer, marked so that none would kill him. And he went out from the presence of the Lord, and dwelt in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So the parents lost him too, not to the grave, but to exile, and to the shadow of what he had become. In a single season the household of the first family had been emptied of both its sons, one in the ground, one gone east, never, it seems, to return. And consider which loss was the harder to bear, for there is a particular anguish in the second kind that the first does not have. To lose Abel was to lose a child to death, a wound beyond words, but a clean wound, a grief without shame, the loss of a son who had done no wrong. But to lose Cain was something stranger and more terrible. To lose a living child to the darkness in his own heart, to have a son who was still alive somewhere out in the land of Nod, and yet was gone in a way that no funeral could mark and no grave could hold. Lost not to death but to evil, not buried but banished, carrying the mark of God and the blood of his brother out into the wandering dark. The first parents grieved one son dead and one son damned, and there is no harder grief than that, to mourn the child you buried, and to mourn differently, and when perhaps more bitterly, the child you did not. Theek, the one still walking the earth, whom you have nonetheless lost. Both sons were gone, the house was empty of them both, and the difference between the two emptinesses was the difference between a grave and an exile, between a sorrow you could weep clean, and a sorrow shot through with shame. Sit with that for a moment, because the text passes over it quickly, and we should not imagine the first man and the first woman in the long evening after all of this. They had walked out of paradise together. They had hoped surely that their children would be the beginning of something that out of all they had lost, a family would grow, and the promise that God had spoken, even in the moment of the curse, would somehow come true. For there had been a promise. In the very hour that God pronounced judgment on the serpent, he had said a strange and luminous thing, that there would be enmity between the serpent and the woman, between the serpent's seed and the woman's seed, and that the seed of the woman would one day strike the serpent's head, a seed, a descendant, a child of the woman, who would somehow undo the ruin the serpent had begun. That promise was the one thread of hope the first couple carried out of Eden with them. And now, look, the seed of the woman, through whom would it come? Abel was dead. Cain was a murderer and an exile. The hope had narrowed to nothing. The promise hung in the air over an empty house, with no one left to carry it. And consider what it would have meant to grieve in that particular way. To grieve as the very first people ever to grieve. We have all of us a long inheritance of mourning to draw on. When we lose someone, we are joined by everyone who has ever lost someone, by all the rituals and words and consolations that the human race has built up over the ages to help us bear the unbearable. The first man and woman had none of that. They were the first to stand over a grave. They were the first to feel the specific bottomless ache of a child who will not come back. No one had ever told them how to carry it, because no one had ever carried it before. There were no words for it yet, no customs, no comfort handed down, only the raw, unprecedented fact of a son in the ground, and another son gone east, and the silence afterward, and the question of whether life itself had any point now, whether the future they had imagined had simply ended in that field. They were grieving without a map in a world that had only just learned that grief was possible. And it is into precisely that, into the rawest, most uncharted sorrow the world had ever known, that the third son was born. This is the silence Seth was born into, not the silence of peace, but the silence after a funeral, not the hush of a beginning, but the stunned quiet of people who have lost almost everything, and do not know whether the future has any place for them at all. The first death was still fresh. The first grave was still raw. The first family was still reeling, and into that silence, the text says, the first man knew his wife again, and she conceived and bore a son, a third son, born late, born after, born into grief, born to a mother who had buried one child and lost another, and who must have held this new infant with a complicated tenderness. We can only imagine joy and terror braided together, hope shadowed by everything she had already learned about how badly things could go. She had borne sons before. She knew now that a son could be murdered. She knew that a son could become a murderer, and here was another small and new and utterly vulnerable. The whole fragile future of the human race, once again impossibly on a single newborn child. And she gave him a name, and the name she gave him, and the words she spoke when she gave it, tell us everything about what this child meant not only to her, but to the entire story that was hanging by a thread. She did not name him for his beauty, or for some hope of his greatness, or for any quality of his own. She named him for what he was for. She named him as a replacement. She named him as the answer to a grief. She looked at this third son, born in the shadow of the first grave, and she said that God had given her another seed in the place of the one she had lost. And in that single sentence, another seed in place of Abel. The whole meaning of Seth's life is already contained. He was the seed given in place of the seed that died. He was the carrier of a promise that had almost perished. He was the thread picked up again after it had very nearly broken for good. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son, and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another seed instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. It is one short verse, and it is easy to read past, but almost every word of it is doing something. And if we slow down and listen, it opens like a door onto the whole hidden architecture of the Ray story. Begin with the name itself, Seth. In Hebrew, the name is connected to the verb shath, to set, to place, to appoint, to put in position, to establish something, to lay it down where it is meant to be. And the mother says exactly this. God has appointed Shath for me another seed. The name is a pun, a play on the very word she uses to explain it. The child is called appointed because God has appointed him. He is the one who has been set in place, set down deliberately by the hand of God into the gap that death and exile had torn open. He is not an accident. He is not merely the next child to come along. He is, the mother insists, an act of God, a placing, a setting, a deliberate restoration of something that had been lost. Where there had been an empty place, God has set a son. Where the line had been broken, God has put a new link. The name is a confession that this child is not the random continuation of a family, but the intentional rescue of a promise. And then there is that word, seed. God has appointed for me another seed. It is a strange word to use for a baby. We might expect another son, another child, but the mother says seed, and the word is chosen with care, because it reaches back to the one promise that mattered more than any other. You will remember it at the gates of Eden in the moment of judgment. God had spoken to the serpent and said that he would put enmity between the serpent and the woman, and between the serpent's seed and the woman's seed, and that the woman's seed would bruise the serpent's head. Though the serpent would bruise his heel, the seed of the woman, the promised descendant, who would at terrible cost undo the work of the serpent and crush the ancient enemy. That word seed had been ringing in the air of the world ever since the single bright thread of hope running through all the grief. The promise that somewhere in the line of the woman's children, a deliverer was coming. And so when the mother holds her third son and says, God has appointed for me another seed, she is not merely noting that she has had another baby. She is making a claim about destiny. She is saying the seed, the promised seed, the line that was supposed to crush the serpent, that seed did not die with Abel. God has appointed another. The thread that seemed to snap in the field has been knotted back together in this child. The promise lives. The hope of the woman's seed, which had narrowed almost to extinction, has been set back in place. This is the seed. Through this child, the promise will go on. It is worth pausing to feel how close it had come to ending. Consider the three sons of the first woman and what each represented. Abel was the righteous one, the one whose offering pleased God, the one the New Testament would later call righteous Abel, the first of all, the faithful. If the promised seed were to come through anyone, surely it would be through him. And he was murdered, childless. His line ended before it began. His only legacy, the blood that cried from the ground. Then there was Cain, the firstborn, the one who by the custom of the world should have carried the line. And he was the murderer, the one who had given himself over to the very darkness. The promise was meant to defeat, cast out, marked, gone east into exile. If you were watching this story unfold, you would have said the promise was finished. The righteous son was dead. The firstborn was a killer. There was no one. The seed of the woman had no one left to be. And notice that there was no guarantee of a third son at all. This is the thing we read past because we know how the story ends. But the first parents did not know. There was no promise that another child would come. They were not young. They had borne their sons and watched their world collapse. For all they knew, Abel's grave and Cain's exile were the end of the line. Full stop. The human story, narrowing to two grieving elders with no future, the promise of the seed dying with them in a world of thorns. The third son was not owed to them. He was not the inevitable next chapter. He was a gift that did not have to come, given into a situation that had no claim on it, a mercy where there might simply have been an ending. And that is exactly why the mother's words at his birth carry the weight they do. She does not say, "And then we had another child," as though it were the natural course of things. She says, "God has appointed. God has done this. God has set this child in place. God has reached into a dead end and made a way where there was no way." The third son was grace in the oldest and purest sense, an undeserved gift given freely into a hopeless place. The hand of God moving where human hope had run out entirely. And then, into that nothing, God appointed Seth. This is the first and deepest thing to understand about him, and it is the thing the world has most completely forgotten. Seth is the seed of the promise recovered. He is hope restored after it had failed. He is the proof, written into the third chapter of the human story, that the purposes of God do not die when the people we expected to carry them die. That when the righteous one is struck down, and the chosen one betrays his calling, God is not defeated, but simply appoints another. The whole later Bible will turn on this pattern again and again. The promise passing not through the obvious heir, but through the unexpected one, the younger, the overlooked, the one born after loss. And it begins here with Seth, the appointed one, the set-in-place one, the other seed given to a grieving mother in the shadow of the first grave, carrying in his small and unremembered person the entire future of the human race and the unbroken thread of the promise of God. And once you have seen that pattern begin in Seth, you will see it everywhere in the story that follows, because it becomes one of the great recurring rhythms of the whole Bible. Again and again, the line of promise will seem to fail, and again God will appoint another. The chosen son will not be the firstborn Ishmael but the late-born Isaac. It will not be the elder Esau, but the younger Jacob. It will not be the obvious sons of Jesse, but the youngest, David, the one out keeping the sheep, the one no one even thought to call in from the field. Over and over, the thread of the promise will pass, not to the one the world would have chosen, not to the strong, the firstborn, the obvious heir, but to the unexpected one, the overlooked one, the one who comes after, the one appointed by God, where human reckoning saw no one. And the very first time that pattern appears, the template for all the rest is here, in Seth, the third son, the replacement, the one given after the obvious carriers of the promise had both been lost. He is the first of the great line of God's unexpected choices, the first proof that when the human story seems to have run into a dead end, God has a way of appointing another and beginning again. There is a quiet comfort buried in this, and it is worth drawing out before we go on, because it is part of why this old and forgotten story still matters. Most of us, if we are honest, do not feel like Cain or Abel. We are not the famous ones, the dramatic ones, the ones whose stories get told. We are not the brilliant firstborn or the tragic martyr. We are more like Seth, the ones who come after, the ones born into the aftermath of other people's stories, the ones who simply have to pick up the thread and carry it a little further, without much notice and without much fame. And the story of Seth says that this is not a lesser thing. It says that the quiet one who comes after, the one almost no one remembers, can be precisely the one through whom everything is carried forward. The promise did not survive through the famous brothers, it survived through the forgotten one, and that all by itself is a kind of grace. The assurance that you do not have to be remembered by the world in order to matter to the story, that the unremembered link is still a link, and that the thread runs on through exactly the kind of quiet, faithful, overlooked life that most of us are actually living. And there is a further comfort, gentler still, folded inside the first. Seth was a replacement. He was, in the plainest terms, the child who came instead of the child who was lost the second chance, the one given after grief, the one whose very existence was bound up with a loss that came before him. There are many of us who carry something like that in our own stories, who were born after a loss or into the shadow of someone else's, who have felt sometimes like the one who came instead of the one who had to fill a place that grief had emptied, the one whose life began in the aftermath of a sorrow we did not cause and could not heal. And the story of Seth says to anyone who has ever felt that the one who comes after the loss is not a lesser child, not a consolation prize, not a shadow of the one who was lost. The one who comes after can be the appointed one, the one set in place by God, the one through whom the whole future flows. Seth did not have to be Abel. He did not have to be the one who was lost. He had only to be himself, the one who was given the appointed seed. And in being that he carried more than the famous brother ever could have. If you have ever felt like the one who came after, the one born into someone else's grief, the story of the forgotten son is in a quiet way a word of grace spoken directly to you. But to see the full meaning of Seth's line, we have to set it beside the other line, the line that did not survive. For the 4th chapter of Genesis gives us 2 genealogies, 2 family trees growing out of the same first parents, 2 roads diverging from the same starting point. And the contrast between them is one of the most carefully drawn and most revealing things in all of early scripture. Before the text tells us about Seth's descendants, it tells us about Cain's. And we should look hard at the line of Cain, because it is only against that dark and dazzling background that the line of Seth comes into focus. Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, and he dwelt in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And there the text says he did a remarkable thing, the first remarkable thing in the whole history of human civilization. He built a city, the very first city the world had ever seen, raised by the hand of the first murderer and named after his son Enoch. Not we should note carefully the famous Enoch who walked with God. That Enoch belongs to Seth's line, and we will come to him. This is a different Enoch, the son of Cain, the namesake of the first city. Think about that. The man who could not bear to be a wanderer, who had been sentenced to roam the earth, instead gathered himself and his descendants behind walls and built something permanent, a city, a fixed place, a monument of human making, in defiance of the sentence of wandering laid upon him. The line of Cain begins with an act of building, an act of settling, an act of making a place for itself in the world by its own strength. And the line went on, and it became brilliant. The text traces it down through the generations, and what it gives us is nothing less than the birth of human culture. From Cain's line came Jabal, who was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock, the first of the herdsmen, the founder of a whole way of life. And his brother was Jubal, who was the father of all those who play the lyre and the pipe, the first musician, the origin of all music, the one from whom every song that has ever been sung somehow descends. And there was Tubal-cain, a forger of all instruments of bronze and iron, the first metalworker, the master of fire and ore, the one who learned to pull metal from stone and beat it into tools and blades. The arts of civilization, the herring, the music, the metalwork, all of it, the text says, came from the line of Cain. They were makers, they were builders, they were the brilliant, restless, creative children of the exiled brother, and they filled the early world with cities and songs, and the gleam of worked metal. But something else grew in the line of Cain alongside the brilliance, and the text lets us see it in a single chilling portrait. For the line comes down to a man named Lamech, and Lamech is the dark fruit of Cain's tree. He was the first man recorded to take 2 wives, breaking the pattern of the beginning. And he speaks to those 2 wives, the first poem in the Bible, and it is a poem of murder. He says, "I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me." If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. Listen to it. It is a boast. It is a song of vengeance sung in pride, glorying in killing. Cain had killed in jealousy, and then hidden in fear. His descendant Lamech kills, and then composes a victory chant about it, escalating his ancestors' violence into something celebrated, something sung. The line that began with one murder committed in shame has arrived. A few generations on, at murder turned into music, bloodshed as boast, killing as art. The brilliance and the violence have grown up together, twined around each other, until the same line that gave the world the lyre also gives it the war song. That is the line of Cain, magnificent and murderous, creative and cruel, the builders of the murderous Enosh, Mebruk, Shire, and also the men who turned vengeance into poetry and broke the world's first bonds. It is the line of human achievement uncoupled from God, racing ahead in brilliance and in mande. Violence both building a glittering civilization east of Eden, in the land of wandering far, from the presence of the Lord, that their father had walked out of. And we should not be too quick to despise it, because there is something in the line of Cain that we too recognize, something, if we are honest, that we admire. These were not stupid people, or weak people, or idle people. They were the most gifted human beings the young world had yet produced. They looked at a world without cities, and built one. They looked at a world without music, and drew the first melody out of a reed and a string. They looked at stone that held metal locked inside it, and learned to free it with fire and shape it with the hammer. Every comfort, every art, every tool that has ever made human life richer or easier traces back, in the logic of this story, to the restless genius of Cain's line. They were the first to take the raw given world and bend it to the human will. The first to make, the first to build, the first to fill the silence with song. We are in 1,000 ways their cultural heirs. Every city we live in, every instrument we play, every blade and engine and machine we have ever forged, is a distant child of Jabal and Jubal and Tubal-cain. The brilliance was real, but the brilliance was not the whole story, and the text will not let us forget the other half. For alongside the making grew the violence, and the violence grew faster. Cain killed once in jealousy, and hid in shame, and trembled at the thought that someone might do to him what he had done to his brother. A few generations later, his descendant Lamech kills and turns it into a song, not hiding, not trembling, but boasting, glorying, setting his bloodshed to verse, and singing it to his wives as a thing to be proud of. That is the trajectory of the line, not merely that it was violent, but that its violence escalated generation by generation, even as its brilliance increased. The same line that perfected the art of music, perfected alongside it the art of vengeance. The same hands that forged the first beautiful tools forged the first beautiful weapons. The genius and the cruelty grew up together, feeding each other until the line of Cain became a thing of terrible splendor, a civilization dazzling in its gifts and darkening in its heart, building ever higher, even as it sank ever deeper into the very violence that had begun in a field with a stone. It is the oldest portrait in the world of what the human race can become when it pours all its genius into making and none of it into goodness. Brilliant, productive, magnificent, and lost. And then the text turns deliberately back to Seth after the whole dazzling, terrible pageant of Cain's line, the city, the tents, the music, the metal, the murder song, the camera, as it were, pulls away from all that brilliance and comes to rest on the quiet third son and his descendants. And what it tells us about Seth's line, in contrast to all the achievements of Cain's, is almost nothing. No city, no invention, no art, no great works of bronze or song. The line of Seth builds nothing the world would notice. It produces no monuments. Set beside the brilliant children of Cain, the children of Seth look like nothing at all, except for one thing. One single thing told in one single sentence that turns out to matter more than every city and every song and every blade. The line of Cain never made to Seth. Also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time people began to call upon the name of the Lord. That is it. That is the whole achievement of Seth's line, as the text first presents it. Not a city, a prayer, not an invention, an invocation, not a tower of brick or a song of vengeance, but this, that in the days of Seth and his son Enosh, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. For the first time in the history of the world, human beings turned their faces back toward the God their parents had walked away from, and called on his name, worshipped, prayed, cried out, reached back across the gulf that sin had opened toward the presence that had been lost. While the line of Cain was building its city and forging its blades and singing its proud songs, east of Eden, The line of Seth was doing something the world would never put in a history book. It was learning again how to pray. Think about how quiet, how invisible, how unimpressive that achievement is set beside the works of Cain's line. You cannot see a prayer. You cannot put it in a museum. It builds no walls, raises no towers, leaves no ruins for archaeologists to dig up. 3,000 years later, when the children of Cain finished their work, there was a city standing where there had been none. There was music in the air, where there had been silence. There were tools and blades gleaming, where there had been only raw stone. When the children of Seth finished their work, there was nothing the eye could see. A people on their knees, faces turned upward, voices lifted toward a presence no one could touch. By every measure the world uses to weigh greatness, the line of Cain was the success, and the line of Seth was the footnote. And yet the text, which knows exactly what it is doing, gives the whole pageant of Cain's, only to set against it this one quiet sentence about Seth's line, and to make us feel by the contrast that the invisible thing the Sethites did was somehow weightier than everything the Canaanites built. The calling on the name outweighs the city. The prayer outlasts the song. The turning back toward God is in the strange economy of this story the only achievement that finally counts. Hold the two lines side by side, because the contrast is the whole point, and the text has drawn it with exquisite care. On one side, the line of Cain building outward, building upward, filling the world with the works of human hands, making a name and a place and a civilization by its own strength, brilliant and self-sufficient, and increasingly violent, and moving always away, away from the garden, away from the presence, into the land of wandering and the city of exile. And on the other side, the line of Seth, building almost nothing, inventing almost nothing, leaving almost no mark on the world at all, but turning quietly, persistently, back toward God, calling on His name, keeping alive the one thing that the line of Cain had lost entirely, the memory that there is a God to be called upon, and the longing to call upon Him. Two seeds, two roads, the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. You might almost say the line that runs ever further from God in brilliance and in violence, and the line that runs, however quietly, back toward Him. And the whole rest of the Bible, in a sense, is the long story of these two seeds, these two ways of being human, winding down through the centuries, the way of the city and the sword, and the way of the altar and the name. It begins here in the 4th chapter of the human story, in the contrast between the dazzling children of Cain and the praying children of Seth. And the deepest irony of all, the thing the story is quietly insisting on, is that it was not the brilliant line that survived. The line of Cain, for all its cities and songs and blades, would be swept away entirely by the flood, leaving nothing. It was the quiet line, the praying line, the line that built nothing and called on the name that carried the human race across the waters and into every age that followed. The makers vanished, the worshippers remained. And the contrast is not only ancient history, it is a mirror, and the two lines run through every human heart, including yours and mine. For we all feel the pull of the line of Cain, the longing to build, to make, to achieve, to leave a mark on the world, to fill the silence with the works of our own hands, and to be admired for them. It is a good longing in its way. The making of things is part of what it means to be human, part of the image we bear. But the story warns us what happens when that longing becomes everything, when the building turns into a way of living without God, when the achievement becomes a substitute for the name, when we pour all our genius into making and none of it into goodness, and the brilliance races ahead while the heart grows cold and hard and finally cruel. And against that, the story sets the quieter pull of the line of Seth, the longing underneath all. Our building to turn back toward the one we came from, to call on the name, to walk with God, to keep alive in ourselves the memory that there is a presence we were made for and have wandered from. The whole drama of the two lines is replayed in miniature every time a human being chooses, whether to live for the city or for the altar, for the mark we leave on the world, or for the God we turn our face toward. And the story has already told us which of the two roads leads in the end to the ark, and which leads down beneath the waters. And here is the verdict of the flood, rendered in advance, that the whole contrast is driving toward. When the waters came, the city of Cain went under. The tents and the herds went under. The lyre and the pipe, the bronze and the iron, the proud songs of vengeance. All of it, every dazzling work of the brilliant line, went down beneath the rising waters, and was gone, leaving not a trace that any spade has ever found. The makers vanished, and the worshippers, the quiet line that had built nothing, invented nothing, left no monument, but had simply called on the name, and walked with God, and handed the thread forward. The worshippers remained, one household of them, at least Noah and his family, the last faithful remnant of the line of Seth, carried alive across the very waters that erased the works of Cain. It is the great reversal at the heart of the whole story, and it is worth letting it land with full weight, because it overturns everything the world believes about what lasts. The brilliant achievements did not last. The quiet faithfulness did. The line that built the city is gone without a trace. The line that learned to pray is the line that every living person descends from. In the long account of things, it was not the makers, but the worshippers who inherited the earth. The 5th chapter of Genesis opens like the turning of a great page. This is the book of the generations of Adam, and then it begins to walk name by name down the line of Seth, from Adam to Seth to Enosh and onward, generation after generation, all the way to Noah. It is in form another genealogy, another list, but this one has a music to it, a rhythm, a solemn repeating cadence that is unlike anything else in the early chapters of the Bible. And once you hear it, you never forget it. For each man in the line, the text gives the same 3 things in almost the same words. How long he lived before he fathered the son who would carry the line, the fathering of that son, and the years he lived afterward, and the other sons and daughters he had. And then, at the end of each life, the same 4 words, falling like a slow and steady drum beat down the length of the chapter, and he died. Adam lived 930 years, and he died. Seth lived 912 years, and he died. Enosh lived 95 years, and he died. Kenan, 910 years, and he died. Mahalalel, 895 years, and he died. Jared, 962 years, and he died. Over and over, life after life, the enormous spans of years. 8 centuries, 9 centuries, almost 1,000 years apiece. And then always inevitably the same ending, and he died. It tolls through the chapter like a bell. However long the life, and these are the longest lives in all of Scripture, lives that stretch across spans of time, we can barely imagine the end is always the same. The refrain never changes, and he died, and he died, and he died. There is something almost unbearably moving about that repetition, if you let yourself feel it. This is the line of the promise. This is the seed that was appointed, the line that called on the name of the Lord, the carriers of the one bright hope of the human race. And the chapter that records them is in its bones, a chapter about death. For all their long centuries of life, for all their faithfulness, for all that they kept the thread and called on the name, every one of them comes in the end to the same 4 words. The promise was alive in them, and yet they died. The seed was carried forward through them, and yet they died. The shadow of the first grave, the grave of Abel, the death that entered the world in that field, falls across every single name in the long line of Seth, and he died. The wages of what happened in the garden are being paid generation after generation down the whole length of the chapter, and not even the line of the promise is exempt. And notice what the great lengths of those lives do and do not change. 900 years, 930, 969, in the case of Methuselah, the longest life ever lived. These are spans of time so vast that a single one of these men would have watched the world change beyond recognition, would have known his great-great-great-grandchildren and their children after them, would have remembered things no one else alive could remember, would have carried in his own memory nearly the whole history of the world. And yet at the end of even the longest of them, the same 4 words, Methuselah lived 969 years, longer than any human being, before or since. And then the text says of him exactly what it says of every other, and he died. The length of the life does not change its ending. You can live a span that makes our 80 years and 10 look like an afternoon, and still the bell tolls, still the 4 words fall, still the grave waits. At the end of all those centuries, there is a hard and quiet honesty in that. However long the life, however full, however faithful the door, at the end is the same door. The chapter will not let us pretend otherwise. And yet, and this is the quiet glory hidden inside the sorrow, the thread does not break. That is the other thing the chapter is doing underneath its drumbeat of death. For though each man dies, before he dies, he fathers the next. The life is passed on. The seed is handed forward. Adam dies, but not before Seth. Seth dies, but not before Enosh. Enosh dies, but not before Canaan. Death takes each one in turn, but death is always one step too late, because the thread has already been passed to the next hand before the last hand falls. The refrain of death told tolls through the chapter, but woven through it just as steadily is the quieter refrain of birth, of fathering, of the line continuing. And he died, but first he fathered. The light is passed on before the one who carried it goes dark. And so the line runs on down through the centuries, through death after death after death, never once breaking the promise, traveling hand to hand, down the long corridor of the death, generations, always one birth ahead of the grave. This is what the line of Seth really was. Beneath the long numbers and the solemn refrain, it was a relay, a handing on, a thread passed from one mortal hand to the next, across spans of years. So vast, they make our own lives look like a single breath. And yet for all those years, all those deaths, the thread never dropped. Each generation received the promise from the one before, and carried it as far as a human life could carry it, and then at the last handed it forward, and lay down, and died. They were not famous. They built no cities. The chapter tells us almost nothing about who they were, what they did, what they hoped or feared across their 900 years. It tells us only that they lived and fathered and died, that they were links in a chain, carriers of a thread, keepers of a flame they did not light and would not see fulfilled. And that was enough. That was their whole calling, and they fulfilled it. And the thread came down through them unbroken, all the way toward the flood and the ark to come. And there is a tenderness hidden in the very mechanics of that relay, in the overlapping of the sword. Long lives that the numbers quietly reveal if you trace them. Because the lives were so long, the generations overlapped enormously. The fathers did not die when their sons were young. They lived on for centuries alongside their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, so that the line was not a chain of strangers, but a great living household of overlapping memory. Adam himself, who had walked in Eden and lost it, lived on by the numbers of the chapter for many centuries into the life of the line, long enough that his descendants for generations could have heard from the very lips of the first man what the garden had been like, and what had been lost, and what God had promised at the gate. The memory of Eden was not a rumor passed down through 100 forgetful mouths. It was a living testimony, carried by men who had spoken to men who had spoken to Adam, or to Adam himself. The faith of the line was kept alive not only by the handing on of a thread, but by the long overlapping presence of the elders, the old ones who remembered, living on among the young, telling them what had been and what was promised, keeping the flame bright by their very presence across the centuries. The relay was not a series of brief broken handoffs in the dark. It was a great overlapping company of the faithful, the old and the young, alive together across enormous spans. The memory and the promise kept warm among them. The flame passed hand to hand among people who knew one another's, of faces, and had heard one another's stories. There is something deeply consoling in that picture. The long-lived faithful generation, folded into generation, keeping the light together. There is a strange dignity in that, the dignity of the faithful link. None of these men of the long line did anything the world would call great. They simply received what came before them and passed it on to what came after. And the entire future of the human race depended on them doing exactly that and nothing more. If any one of them had failed to pass the thread forward, the whole line would have ended, the promise would have died, and there would be no Noah, no ark, no survival, no us. The unbroken chain of these quiet, long-lived, unremembered men is the reason anyone is alive at all, and not one of their names is famous. They are the great forgotten relay of the human story, the ones who kept the flame burning through the long centuries simply by handing it on, faithfully to a child, before the dark took them. We do not tend to honor that kind of life. The world remembers the builders and the conquerors, the inventors and the artists, the ones who left a visible mark, the children of Cain in the logic of this story, the ones whose works can be pointed to and admired. It does not remember the faithful link, the one whose whole achievement was to receive and to pass on, to keep something alive and hand it forward without ever doing anything the world would write down. And yet the story insists against all our instincts that the faithful link is the one that actually matters most, that the quiet carrying on of the ordinary faithful is the thing the whole future hangs on, far more than the dazzling works of the famous. Most of the people who have ever kept the human story going have been exactly these, unremarkable, unrecorded, unremembered men and women who simply received what their parents gave them and lived faithfully through their own stretch of years and passed it on to their children before they died. There is no monument to them, there is no chapter with their deeds in it. There is only the fact that the thread came down unbroken through their faithful hands, and that the story says is no small thing. It is in fact the thing on which everything else depends. But in the middle of that long corridor of names, in the middle of that steady, sorrowful drumbeat of "and he died," the chapter does something it does for no one else. It comes to one name, and for that one man the refrain changes. The drumbeat skips. The bell does not toll. For one man in the entire line of Seth, it is not written that he died at all. His name was Enoch, the seventh from Adam in the line of Seth. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, and then Enoch. And when the chapter reaches him, the music changes. For every other man, the text says he lived, and he fathered, and he lived more years, and he died. But for Enoch, it says something different. It says, Enoch walked with God, and it says it twice, as if to make sure we do not miss it, that this man alone among all the long line walked with God, lived his life in a closeness to the divine that set him apart from every name around him. And then, it gives his ending. And his ending is not like the others. It does not say, and he died. It says, and he was not, for God took him. He was not, for God took him. The bell that tolls through the whole rest of the chapter falls silent for Enoch. Where every other life ends in the grave, his ends in a disappearance, a being taken, a vanishing into God. He did not die.
The text seems to say he walked with God so closely, so faithfully for so long, that in the end God simply took him, drew him up and in out of the world, without the doorway of death that every other human being had to pass through. In the middle of the chapter of death, the chapter whose every verse ends in a grave, there is this one man who has no grave, because he was not left behind to be buried. God took him. We will not tell Enoch's whole story tonight, for he is a vast and luminous figure in his own right, the subject of whole ancient books, the visionary who is said to have walked through the heavens and seen the secrets of the cosmos. And he deserves a telling all his own. But we have to pause on him here, in his place in the line of Seth, because of what he means to the line. Think of where he stands. He stands in the middle of that long corridor of, and he died, and he is the proof that death is not the only door. He is the single shaft of light in the chapter of graves. He is the sign planted in the very heart of the Sethite genealogy, that the God the lion had learned to call upon was a God who could do something other than let his faithful ones die. That walking with God might lead in the end not to the grave, but to God himself. And there is something fitting, something almost inevitable about the fact that this one exception comes precisely here in the line of Seth. Remember what defined this line, the single thing the text told us about it. That in the days of Seth and Enosh, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. This was the line that turned back toward God. The line of worship, the line that kept alive the memory of the presence that had been lost. And it is from this line, the praying line, the line that walked toward God rather than away from him, that there arises the one man who walked so closely with God that he was taken up into him without dying. The line that learned to call on the name produced the man who was taken by the one whose name they called. The worship of the many flowers in Enoch into the walking with God of the one. It is as if the whole quiet character of Seth's line, its turning toward God, its calling on the name, its faithfulness in the shadow of death, reaches a kind of summit in Enoch. And in him, for a moment, the shadow of the grave is lifted entirely, and a single member of the line is simply carried home. Think of what Enoch's translation must have meant to the generations that came after him in the line. The ones who carried the story of it forward. They lived under the long drum battered of death. They buried their fathers and would be buried by their sons. The refrain, "and he died," was the truest thing they knew about the world. And yet they also carried handed down with the rest of the family memory the astonishing fact of the ancestor who did not die, the one who walked with God so faithfully that the grave was simply skipped, who was here one day and gone the next, not dead. What hope that must have been, threaded through all the dying. What a strange and stubborn light kept burning in the family's memory across the centuries. That death, which seemed to have the final word over every other name in the line, had once been bypassed entirely. That walking with God might lead somewhere other than the grave. That the faithfulness the line had kept alive was not merely a way of dying well, but might be in the end a way of not dying at all. Enoch was the lion's great rumor of resurrection, planted in the heart of the chapter of death, the sign that the God they called upon was not finally a God of graves, but a God who takes his own to himself. And then the line goes on. Enoch fathered Methuselah, the longest lived of all, 969 years, the very emblem of the great ages of that world. And Methuselah fathered Lamech, not the murderer, Lamech of Cain's line, another Lamech in the line of Seth, as if even the names of the two lines echo each other across the divide. And this Lamech fathered a son, and named him Noah, saying that this child would bring them relief from their painful toil on the ground that the Lord had cursed Noah. The name means rest or relief or comfort. After all its long centuries, after all its deaths, after the one who did not die, now arrives at a child whose very name is a sigh of longing for rest, and who will turn out to be the one through whom the entire line and the entire human race will be carried alive across the waters of the end of the world. There is a strange and beautiful pattern in those last names, if you set them side by side. Enoch, who walked with God and was taken. Methuselah, whose enormous life, the longest ever lived, stretched on and on, as if the world were holding its breath. There is an old tradition which we offer only as tradition, and not as the plain sense of the text, that even Methuselah's name carried a kind of warning folded inside it, that it could be heard to mean something like, "When he dies, it shall come as though his very name were a quiet countdown, and the long, long span of his years were the patience of God, the holding back of the judgment, the mercy that waited and waited." While the line carried the thread forward, until at last the longest life in all of history came to its end, and the waters were loosed upon the world. Whether or not the name truly means that the shape of it is fitting, the longest life standing like a held breath between the world and its judgment. The mercy stretched out across nearly 1,000 years, giving the thread time to reach the one who would carry it across the flood, and then Lamech, who looked at the cursed ground and the painful toil and the long shadow of grief that lay over the whole human story, and who named his son out of a deep and aching hope that this child somehow would bring rest, that there would be at last relief from the labor and the sorrow that had hung over the world since the gates of Eden closed. The line of Seth was from beginning to end a line that longed, a line that called on the name of a God whose presence had been lost, a line that walked toward a garden that was sealed, a line that carried a promise it had not yet seen fulfilled. And here, near the end of it, that longing crystallizes into a single name spoken over a newborn, Noah. Rest. As if the whole weary hope of the line had been poured into the naming of this one child, the hope that the long toil might end, that the curse might lift, that rest might finally come. They did not yet know how. They did not know about the ark or the waters or the world that would be carried across them. They knew only the longing, and they named their child for it. And the longing was not in vain, though it would be answered in a way none of them expected. Not by the lifting of the curse, not yet, but by the carrying of the faithful remnant alive through the very judgment that drowned the world. For the corridor of the generations is approaching its darkest passage. The thread has been carried hand to hand down the long line of Seth through Enoch, who was taken, and Methuselah of the great years, and Lamech, who longed for rest, all the way to Noah. And in Noah's days, the world that the children of Cain and the children of Seth had filled together was about to come to its terrible reckoning. But before the waters rise, the text pauses to tell us something strange, something dark, something that has puzzled and troubled readers for thousands of years, and that turns the whole story of the two lines toward tragedy. It tells us about the sons of God and the daughters of men, At the opening of the 6th chapter of Genesis, just before the flood, the text records one of the strangest and most debated passages in the entire Bible. It is only a few verses long, and it raises more questions than it answers. And for thousands of years, readers have argued over what it means. But it stands at the hinge of the whole story. The last thing we are told about the world before the waters came, and one of the great traditional readings of it turns the story of Seth's line into a tragedy. So we have to enter it carefully. The text says, "When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose." And it goes on to speak of the Nephilim, the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown who were on the earth in those days, and to say that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil, continually, and that he was grieved to his heart and resolved to blot out man from the face of the earth. The sons of God, the daughters of men, the mysterious mighty ones, and then the flood. Who are the sons of God? That is the question, and it has been answered in more than one way across the long history of interpretation. There is one ancient and famous reading, the one we touched on in another story. The reading found in the old apocryphal books, that the sons of God were angelic beings, watchers from heaven, who descended and took human wives, producing a hybrid race, the Nephilim, the giants of the ancient world. That reading is old and influential, and it has its own deep and terrible logic, and we have explored it elsewhere. The story of Seth. For there is another reading equally ancient, and held by many of the great interpreters across the centuries, that turns entirely on the two lines we have been following. In this reading, the sons of God are not angels at all. They are the line of Seth. They are the righteous line, the line that called upon the name of the Lord, the line that walked with God, the sons of God in the sense of being the faithful, the set apart, the children of the promise, those who belong to God and bore his character in the world. And the daughters of men in this reading are the line of Cain, the brilliant, worldly, godless line, the daughters of the city and the sword and the murder song. And the tragedy the passage records is this, that the two lines which had been kept separate, the holy seed and the worldly seed, the line that walked toward God and the line that walked away, at last intermarried. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives, and the wall between the two lines came down. The righteous line and the corrupt line merged. The holy seed lost its separateness, and as the line of Seth dissolved into the line of Cain, the faithfulness that the Sethites had kept alive for all those generations was swallowed up in the brilliance and the violence and the godlessness of the world until The text says, "The wickedness of man was great upon the earth, and every thought of the human heart was only evil continually, and there was nothing left to do but begin again." Why did so many great readers favor this reading over the reading about the angels? Partly because of the very thing we have spent this whole story tracing. The chapters just before this one have gone to enormous trouble to set two human lines against each other. The line of Cain and the line of Seth, the makers and the worshippers, the ones who walked away and the ones who turned back. The whole shape of the story has been building toward a contrast between two kinds of human family, two seeds, two roads. And so when the text arrives at the sons of God and the daughters of men, it seems natural to many readers to hear it as the climax of that very contrast. The moment when the two lines, so carefully distinguished, finally collapse into one. On this reading, the passage is not introducing some strange new business about angels descending from the sky. It is finishing the story of the two lines, telling us how the long separation between Seth's seed and Cain's seed came at last to its tragic end. The holy line did not survive by staying holy. It was seduced, married in, absorbed, and the wall that had kept righteousness alive in the world came down, and the flood became inevitable. Sit with what that reading means, because it is heartbreaking. For all those long centuries, the line of Seth had done one thing faithfully against the whole drift of the world. It had stayed turned toward God, while the line of Cain built and forged and sang and killed. The line of Seth called on the name, walked with God, kept the thread of the promise, handed the flame down the corridor of the generations. Its whole calling, its whole identity was its separateness, its refusal to be swallowed up by the world east of Eden, its stubborn turning back toward the presence that had been lost. And in the end, in this reading, that separateness failed. The sons of God looked at the daughters of men and saw that they were beautiful, and the longing of the heart did what the longing of the heart so often does. It crossed the line that should not have been crossed. It mingled what should have been kept apart, and the holy seed was lost in the world it was supposed to stand against. The line that had kept itself for God gave itself to the world, and the corruption that followed was so total that the earth itself had to be washed clean. We should be careful and honest here, as we have tried to be throughout. The text of Genesis does not say in so many words, "The sons of God were the line of Seth, and the daughters of men with the line of Cain." That identification is an interpretation, a very old and very serious one, held by many great readers across the centuries, but an interpretation nonetheless. The words of the text are spare and mysterious. Sons of God, daughters of men, the Nephilim, the wickedness of man, the grief of God, the coming of the flood. Readers have filled in those spaces in more than one way. But whichever reading we hold, the shape of the tragedy remains, and it remains bound up with everything we have seen of the two lines. Something that was meant to be kept separate was not kept separate. Some boundary that preserved righteousness in the world was crossed. The holy and the corrupt were mingled, and the result was a wickedness so deep that the world could not continue as it was. There is a sober warning folded into that for any age and any heart, and it is worth naming plainly before we move on. The danger to the line of Seth in this reading was not that the world attacked it. The line of Cain did not march out and conquer the line of Seth by force. The holy seed was not destroyed by violence from without. It was lost by attraction from within, by the slow, sweet, entirely understandable pull of the beautiful thing on the other side of the wall. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive. That is how it happened, not by assault, but by allure, not by being overpowered, but by being drawn across a line that had kept them set apart towards something genuinely beautiful, until the separation that had preserved them simply dissolved in the wanting. And that is almost always how the thing that keeps a people or a person faithful is lost. Not by some dramatic defeat, but by the quiet erosion of a boundary, the gradual giving way to an attraction, the slow mingling of what was meant to be kept distinct, until one day the wall is simply gone, and no one can quite remember when it fell. The line of Seth did not lose its calling in a single catastrophic moment. It lost it the way such things are usually lost, gradually, attractively, almost reasonably, until the holy seed had become indistinguishable from the world it was meant to stand apart from, and the flood was the only thing left. And here in this reading, we reach the darkest moment in the whole story of Seth's line, and also hidden within it the thread of hope that will carry everything forward. For if the line of Seth had dissolved into the line of Cain, if the holy seed had been swallowed up in the corruption of the world, then it would seem that the whole long faithfulness of the Sethite generations had come to nothing, that the thread carried so carefully for so long had finally been lost, not to death, but to compromise, not to the grave, but to the slow seduction of the world. And yet the text tells us that there was one man left. In all that corrupt and drowning generation, in all the wreckage of the merged and fallen lines, there was one man who still walked with God as his ancestor Enoch had walked. One man in whom the old Sethite faithfulness still burned. One man who had not been swallowed up. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. The thread had narrowed once again, almost to nothing, down to a single man and his household, exactly as it had once narrowed to the single child, Seth, in the shadow of Abel's grave. But it had not broken. In Noah, the last faithful son of the line of Seth, the thread held, and through him, through the ark and the waters, it would be carried alive into the world to come, while everything else, the whole brilliant and corrupt and merged world of Cain and fallen Seth alike, went down beneath the flood. And do you see the rhyme of it? The way the end of the line echoes its beginning. At the start, The promise had narrowed to a single child, Abel dead, Cain exiled, and then Seth, the one-appointed seed, carrying the whole future of the human race in his small and solitary person. And now, at the other end of the long corridor, after all the generations, after all the long lives and the steady refrain of death, the promise has narrowed again to a single man. A whole world fallen and corrupt and about to be drowned. And then Noah, the one who found favor carrying the whole future of the human race in his single faithful household. The thread that began with one with the appointed seed, Seth comes down at last to one again, to the favored man Noah, and in between it never once dropped below that thin, unbreakable minimum of a single faithful carrier. That is how the promise of God moves through history. Not in great triumphant crowds, but often in the thinnest possible thread, narrowing again and again, almost to nothing, hanging by a single life, and yet never ever breaking. Because at the very moment it seems about to fail, there is always one appointed seed, one man who finds favor, one faithful carrier, where the world saw no one to take the flame the last few steps and hand it across the catastrophe to the world that comes after. There is a legend about the line of Seth that is not in the Bible, but that has haunted the imagination of the world for nearly 2,000 years. It comes to us most famously from the Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, who recorded it as part of the ancient law of the Sethite line. We tell it now clearly marked as tradition and not scripture, but it is a tradition of extraordinary beauty and depth, and it reveals perhaps better than anything else what the line of Seth came to mean in the memory of the ancient world. It is the legend of the two pillars. Josephus tells us that the children of Seth were not only the line of worship and faithfulness, but also the first great students of the heavens. They were, he says, the inventors of that wisdom which concerns the heavenly bodies and their order, the first astronomers, the first to chart the courses of the stars and the cycles of the moon and the sun, the first to read the great clock of the sky and understand its turning. In the long centuries of their enormous lives, lives that stretched across the better part of 1,000 years each, they had time to observe, to study, to accumulate knowledge across generations, and they became wise with a wisdom about the cosmos that no short-lived people could ever match. The line that had learned to call upon the name of the God who made the heavens became, fittingly, the line that learned to read the heavens he had made. There is a quiet rightness in that pairing, that the line of worship should also become the line of wisdom. That the people who turned their faces toward God should also be the people who turned their faces toward the stars. For in the old way of seeing, these were not two different things, but one. To study the heavens was not to turn away from God toward cold mechanics. It was to trace the handwriting of the Maker across the sky, to read in the ordered turning of the stars the faithfulness and the majesty of the one who set them turning. The children of Seth watched the heavens the way a child watches a beloved parent's face, looking for the order, the constancy, the character written there. Their astronomy grew out of their worship, and their worship was deepened by their astronomy. And the two together made them wise in a way that the brilliant, restless, God-forgetting line of Cain, for all its inventions, never was. Cain's line had learned to bend the world to the human will, to forge, to build, to make. Seth's line had learned something harder and quieter, to read the world as a gift and a revelation, to find in the order of the heavens the signature of the God they called upon, and to grow wise not by mastering the world, but by contemplating it. And it was out of that contemplation, the legend says, that the great foreknowledge came, and then Josephus says, they came to know something, whether by their study of the heavens, or by some prophecy handed down. The legend does not fully say. They came to know that the world was destined to be destroyed, not once, but twice. Once by water, and once by fire. There would come a great flood that would drown the world, and there would come at some far end of things a great burning that would consume it. A double destruction was written into the fate of the world, and the wise children of Seth foresaw it. Pause on the strangeness and the weight of that knowledge. Imagine living with it. Imagine being among the few who knew while the rest of the world built and sang and married and forgot that the whole bright edifice of human life was under sentence that the waters were coming, and that beyond the waters at the far end of all things a fire was coming too. It is the heaviest knowledge a creature can carry, the certain foreknowledge of the end. Most of us are mercifully spared the date of our own death, and the world is mercifully spared the date of its own. But the children of Seth in the legend carried exactly that, the knowledge that the end was fixed, that it would come in water and then in fire, that nothing they built could finally stand. And what is remarkable is what they did with that terrible knowledge. They did not despair. They did not give themselves over to the brilliant nihilism of Cain's line, eating and drinking and forging and singing as though nothing mattered because nothing would last. They did the opposite. They sat down in the shadow of the certain end, and they tried to save what was good, to gather the wisdom they had won, and send it forward as a gift past the destruction to whatever might come after. They turned the knowledge of the end not into despair, but into care. And there is something deeply worthy in that. Something that speaks to how a person ought to live, who knows, as all of us secretly know, that the end is coming. Not to build as though we will last forever, and not to abandon everything because we will not, but to gather what is good and true, and to hand it carefully forward past our own ending to those who come after. And so they faced a question that has haunted every wise and mortal people since. How do you keep what you know from being lost? They had gathered across their long centuries a precious treasure of wisdom, the knowledge of the heavens, the understanding of the order of things, the accumulated learning of the only line on earth that still walked with God, and they knew that the world that held this wisdom was going to end. How do you carry knowledge across the end of the world? How do you make wisdom survive a catastrophe that destroys everything? How do you speak to a world that does not yet exist on the far side of a destruction that will erase everything you have built? Their answer was the two pillars. They resolved, Josephus says, to inscribe all their wisdom, all their discoveries about the heavens and their order upon two great pillars, so that the knowledge would outlast them. But here is the genius of it, the detail that makes the legend unforgettable. They made the two pillars of two different materials chosen against the two different destructions they foresaw. One pillar they made of brick, and one pillar they made of stone. For they reasoned thus: if the world were destroyed by water, the pillar of stone would endure. For stone is not dissolved by a flood, and the wisdom inscribed upon it would survive the drowning of the world. And if the world were destroyed by fire, then the pillar of brick baked hard, born of fire, unburnable, would endure the burning, and the wisdom upon it would survive the flames. Whichever destruction came, water or fire, one of the two pillars would remain standing, and the wisdom of the ancient world would not wholly perish, but would be carried across the catastrophe to whatever people might come after. And Josephus adds, with the matter-of-fact tone of a historian reporting a fact, that the pillar of stone remained in his own day in the land he calls Syria, as though the great stone column inscribed with the antediluvian wisdom of the children of Seth were still standing somewhere in the 1st century of our era, a survivor of the drowned world, its strange and ancient script still legible to anyone who could find it and read it. It is a haunting image, and it speaks to something very deep in us, deeper, perhaps, than almost any other legend in this whole story. For the longing behind the two pillars is a longing we have never lost. It is the longing to preserve what we know against the forgetting of the world. It is the impulse behind every library, every archive, every monument, every carved inscription. Every message we have ever tried to send into a future we will not live to see. The children of Seth in the legend looked at the certainty of the world's ending and could not bear that their hard-won wisdom should simply vanish. And so they wrote it in stone and in brick, against water and against fire, casting it forward across the abyss of the end, toward whatever might come after. We do the same. We carve names into stone. We bury time capsules. We send golden records into space. We are all in our way, the children of Seth, raising our pillars against the end of the world, desperate that something of what we have known and loved and understood should survive us. And there is a wisdom in the legend's particular cleverness, the choosing of two materials against two destructions that rewards a moment's thought. The children of Seth did not simply build one great monument and hope for the best. They reasoned about how the world might end, and they built against each possibility. Stone against water, because water cannot dissolve stone. Brick against fire, because brick is itself the child of fire and cannot be burned. It is the thinking of people who took the end seriously, who did not comfort themselves with vague hopes, but looked hard at exactly how their world might be destroyed and built specifically against it. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that care, in the image of these ancient, long-lived, doomed people, knowing their world was going to end, sitting down to reason out precisely which material would survive, which catastrophe, so that their children's children's children, in a world not yet born on the far side of a destruction not yet come, might still be able to read what they had learned. It is love, really. Love reaching across the end of the world. Love for a future they would never see, for descendants they would never meet, for a world that would not remember them. They could not save themselves from the destruction they foresaw, but they could try to save what they knew and send it forward as a gift to whoever might come after. And is that not in the end what every parent, every teacher, every writer, every keeper of any flame has always been doing, trying to hand something precious across the gap of our own death to a world that will go on without us? But the legend set in its place in the story of Seth carries a deeper and quieter truth inside it, a truth that turns the whole image around. For the children of Seth built their two pillars to carry their wisdom across the flood. And yet when the flood actually came, it was not a pillar of stone that carried the human story across the waters. It was not an inscription. It was not knowledge written on a column. It was a living thing, an ark of wood carrying a single faithful family and the seed of every living creature, riding the waters of the end into the world to come. The thing that survived the flood, the thing that carried everything forward, was not a monument, but a life, not a pillar, but a person. Not the wisdom the Sethites had written in stone, but the faithfulness the Sethites had carried in their blood, the thread of the promise handed down the long corridor of the generations, come to rest at last in Noah, the one righteous man who walked with God and was carried alive across the drowning of the world. And so the legend of the pillars, for all its beauty, contains its own gentle correction. The children of Seth thought the precious thing was their knowledge of the heavens, and they built great pillars to save it. But the truly precious thing the line of Seth carried was not their astronomy. It was their faith. It was the calling upon the name that began in the days of Enosh, the walking with God that took up Enoch, the favor in the eyes of the Lord that rested on Noah. That was the real wisdom of Seth's line, not the order of the stars, but the knowledge of the God who made them. And it was carried across the flood, not on a pillar of stone, but in the living heart of a faithful man. The stone pillar may or may not have survived in the land of Syria, but the thing that mattered survived for certain, because it was alive, and it was carried in the ark, and it came down through Noah to every age that followed. And if you are willing to receive it, it has come down even to you. The deepest wisdom of the oldest world was never the kind of thing you could carve on a column. It was the kind of thing you could only carry in a life and pass like a flame to a child. There is a lesson in that. For every age that has tried to outlast itself, and ours perhaps most of all, we are more than any people who ever lived, builders of pillars, keepers of vast archives, makers of records that we hope will outlast us, anxious to preserve every fact and image and word against the forgetting of time. And there is nothing wrong with that. The children of Seth were not wrong to build their pillars, and we are not wrong to build ours. But the story quietly reminds us that the most important things are not finally the things that can be carved on a pillar or stored in an archive. The knowledge of how to live, the faithfulness that turns toward God, the love that calls upon the name, the trust that carries a promise forward through the dark. These cannot be written on stone and left for the next world to read. They can only be lived and shown and handed on from one living person to another parent, to child teacher, to student, the old to the young, hand to hand down the corridor of the generations. You cannot inscribe faith on a pillar. You can only carry it in a life and pass it on before you die. The Sethites' astronomy, for all their care, may have been lost beneath the waters along with everything else. But their faith was not lost because it was never entrusted to stone in the first place. It was entrusted to a person, to Noah. And a person can do what no pillar can. A person can climb into the ark and ride the waters of the end and step out alive into the world, to come still carrying the living flame. And that in the end is the answer the story gives to the oldest human fear. The fear that everything we are and know and love will simply be forgotten. The pillars crumble, the archives burn or drown or are lost, the monuments fall. Nothing made of stone outlasts the end of the world for certain, but the flame carried in living hands and passed faithfully on comes through not because it is more durable than stone, but because it is alive, and the living can be carried across the catastrophe in a way that stone cannot. The line of Seth did not survive because it built the best monument. It survived because it kept the flame alive and carried it and handed it on until it reached the one man who could carry it through the flood. The pillar of stone was a noble idea, but the ark was the true vessel, and the living faith was the true treasure, and the quiet faithfulness handed down the generations was the true and only pillar that actually reached the other side. There is one more story about Seth that we should tell, and like the legend of the pillars, it is not in the Bible. It comes from an ancient book that grew up around the figures of Adam and Eve and their children, a book that tried to imagine the things the scripture left unsaid, what the first family felt, what they did, how the first man came at last to die. We tell it again, clearly marked as tradition and not scripture. But it is one of the most tender stories in all of the old law, and it casts Seth in the role that suits him best of all, the role of the one sent back toward the lost home, the bearer of a longing for a mercy not yet given. The story is set at the end of Adam's long life. The first man after his 930 years lay dying, the first man to grow old, the first to feel his enormous span of years finally running out. And he was in pain, the legend says, weary and suffering, longing for relief. And he remembered the garden. He remembered Eden, the paradise he had lost, and the tree of life that had stood within it, whose fruit and whose oil could heal and could give life. And in his suffering he conceived a desperate hope that perhaps even now, even after everything, a little of the mercy of that garden might be granted to him, a drop of the oil of life from the tree he had been driven away from to ease his dying. And so he called for Seth. Of all his children, it was Seth. He sent Seth, the appointed one, the faithful son, the carrier of the promise. He sent Seth together with Eve on a journey back toward the place they had been exiled from, back toward the gate of paradise, back toward the lost home to beg at the very threshold for the oil of mercy from the tree of life, that it might be given to the dying Adam to comfort him in his last hours. Imagine that journey. Imagine Seth and his mother retracing the oldest exile in the world, walking back toward the garden that had been sealed behind his parents before he was ever born. Seth had never seen Eden. He was born east of it in the world of thorns and labor and death, the world after the fall. He knew paradise only as historianly, as the lost home his parents grieved, for only as the place the whole sorrow of the world had flowed out of. And now he walked toward it, the son of the exiles, going back to the gate his parents had been driven through to ask for mercy at the border of a home he had never known. There is something almost piercingly tender in the picture of the two of them on that road, the aged mother and the faithful son, walking back toward the beginning of all loss. For Eve, every step would have been a step back into memory, back toward the place where she had been young and unfallen, where she had walked with God in the cool of the day, where the great catastrophe had happened that unmade the whole world. She was walking back toward the scene of the deepest grief and the deepest guilt of her life, toward the gate she had been driven through in shame, now leaning perhaps on the arm of the very son who had been given to her to replace the one her firstborn had killed. And for Seth, every step was a step into a sorrow that was not his own, and yet was the source of everything in his life, the lost home he had never seen, the grief he had been born into, the exile he had inherited without ever having chosen it. The two of them, mother and son, the woman who had lost paradise and the boy born outside its walls, walking together back toward the gate to beg for a mercy for the dying first man. It is one of the quietest and most human scenes in all the old law, and it has the ache of every family that has ever walked back together toward an old wound, carrying a hope they are not sure will be answered. And they came to the gate of paradise. And there, the legend says, they were met by the great angel Michael, the guardian of the holy places. And Seth made his plea that the oil of mercy might be given for the dying Adam from the tree of life. And the answer that came was both a denial and a promise. And it is the heart of the whole story. For the oil of mercy could not be given. Not now, not yet. The time for it had not come. The angel told Seth that he could not have the oil of the tree of life to carry back to his father, that Adam must die as all must die, that the door of death could not yet be bypassed, that the full healing of the world was not a thing that could be fetched in a flask and carried home that day. The mercy Adam longed for was real, but it was not yet available. It lay in the future, beyond a long waiting, on the far side of ages, not yet come, but it would come. That was the promise folded inside the denial. The oil of mercy was not denied forever, only deferred. At the end of days, the angel said, in the fullness of time, the mercy of God would come. The tree of life would be opened again. The healing Adam longed for would be poured out upon the world. Not now, but surely, certainly, at the last. And Seth was given in some versions a glimpse of the garden, a vision of the paradise that was lost and that would one day be restored, and a sign or a token to carry back not the oil itself, but the promise of the oil, not the healing now, but the certain hope of healing to come. Think of what that glimpse would have meant to him. Seth had never seen Eden. He was born outside its walls, into the world of thorns. And now for a moment at the gate he is given to see at the lost home, the garden his parents had grieved for all his life, the place the whole sorrow of the world had flowed out of, still there, still beautiful, still kept behind the gate and the flaming sword. He sees what was lost. He sees that it was real, that it still exists, that it has not been destroyed but only sealed, only deferred, only held in waiting for the day of its reopening. And then he must turn around and walk back down into the world of thorns, carrying the memory of a beauty he cannot enter, and a promise he will not live to see fulfilled. That too is the faith of Seth's line, to have glimpsed the garden, to know it is real and is kept and will be opened, and yet to live out one's days outside its gate, in the world of labor and grief, carrying the vision and the promise forward to children who will themselves live and die outside the gate, all of them sustained by nothing but the certainty that the gate will one day open and the oil of mercy will one day be poured out. They were the people who had seen the garden from the outside and chosen to keep walking and keep believing and keep handing the promise on. And Seth carried that back to his dying father. Not a cure, but a promise. Not the end of death, but the assurance that death would not have the last word forever. Adam died the refrain of the 5th chapter, falling on the first man as it would fall on all his line. And he died, but he died in the legend, with the promise in his ears that the mercy he longed for was coming. that the garden was not lost forever, that at the end of days the oil of mercy would be poured out, and the long exile would be healed. There is a later turn to this legend, one that grew up in the Christian imagination across the medieval centuries, and we mention it lightly, marked clearly as a much later tradition layered on top of the old one. In some versions, Seth was given not only a promise, but seeds from the tree or a branch of it, and these were placed at Adam's burial in the mouth of the first man, or planted upon his grave. And from those seeds, the legend says, a tree grew, a tree that lived on through the generations, and whose wood in the long fullness of time became the wood of the cross, upon which the mercy of God was finally poured out for the healing of the world. It is a legend and a late one, and we hold it as such. But you can see what the medieval imagination was reaching for. A thread running from the dying Adam through the faithful Seth across all the ages, to the very place where the oil of mercy was at last given, as though Seth, in carrying home the promise of a mercy deferred, had carried the first seed of the world's eventual healing. It is, when you sit with it, a strangely beautiful way of imagining the whole shape of the story we have been telling. For the medieval legend takes the great theme of Seth's line, the deferred mercy, the promise carried forward across the ages, the not yet but surely spoken at the gate of Eden, and it draws that thread all the way to its end. The mercy that was denied to the dying Adam, the oil that could not be given that day, the healing that was promised for the end of days in this legend, it is not forgotten and it is not lost. It travels hidden down through the generations, carried first by Seth and then by the long line after him, growing quietly like a tree across the centuries, until at last, in the fullness of time, it arrives at the place where the promise is kept and the mercy is finally poured out. Whether or not any of the details are true, and they are legend and we hold them as legend, the instinct behind them is the very instinct of Seth's whole line, that the mercy denied today is not denied forever, that the promise carried forward in faith is not carried in vain, that the seed planted in grief and darkness can grow across ages. No single life can span into the very healing the world was waiting for. The faith of Seth was a faith in a mercy not yet given, and the medieval dreamers, reaching across 1,000 years of their own, imagined that faith vindicated at the last, the deferred mercy finally arriving, the long not yet becoming. At the end of all the waiting, and now. Whatever we make of the later embellishments, the heart of the old story is clear, and it is the perfect role for Seth. He is the one sent back toward the lost home. He is the bearer of the longing for mercy. He is the son who stands at the gate of paradise, the gate his parents were driven through, the gate he himself was born outside of, and receives the great answer that the whole human race has had to learn to live by. Not yet, but surely, not now, but at the end of days. The mercy is real, the healing is coming, the garden is not lost forever, but the time for it has not yet come, and in the meantime, you must carry the promise home, and wait, and trust, and die in hope. That is the faith of the line of Seth, distilled into a single journey. They were the people of the deferred mercy, the people who called upon the name of a God whose full salvation had not yet come at you, walked with a God whose garden was still sealed, who carried the promise of a healing they would not live to see, and handed it like everything else down the long corridor of the generations toward the day when the oil of mercy would finally be poured out. And if you have ever had to live in that particular way, holding a hope whose fulfillment keeps receding, trusting a promise you may not live to see kept, carrying a longing for a mercy that has not yet come, then you already know the faith of Seth from the inside. And this old story is in a quiet way about you, for not yet, but surely is one of the hardest things a human heart is ever asked to hold. It would be easier in a sense to be told a flat no so that we could grieve and be done, and it would be easier to be given the mercy now in our hands today. But the answer Seth received at the gate is the answer most of us actually live under. That the thing we long for most deeply is real and is coming and is certain, but is not here yet and may not arrive in our lifetime, and must be waited for and trusted and carried forward to those who come after us, who may themselves not see it, who may have to carry it further still. The whole line of Seth lived under that answer. Not one of them saw the oil of mercy poured out. Every one of them died, and he died with the promise still ahead of them, unfulfilled, deferred, and yet they kept calling on the name. They kept walking with God. They kept handing the promise forward. That is what it looks like to live by a hope you will not live to see, and it is perhaps the deepest and quietest kind of faith there is. Not the faith that gets what it asks for, but the faith that keeps trusting and keeps carrying through a whole lifetime of not yet toward us. Surely it leaves to its children to inherit. We began with a forgotten son with two famous brothers, the killer and the killed, and a third who came after whom almost no one remembers. We asked why he mattered. This quiet third son born in the shadow of the first grave. And now at the end we know he mattered, because he was the thread. He was the seed appointed in the place of the seed that died. The promise picked up again after it had almost broken for good. He was the head of the quiet line, the praying line, the line that built no cities and forged no blades and sang no songs of vengeance, but that turned its face back toward God and called upon His name and walked with Him through the long centuries and carried the thread of the promise down the corridor of the generations, hand to hand, through death after death, never once letting it fall. He mattered because it was not the brilliant line of Cain that survived the end of the world, but the faithful line of Seth, and from that line came Noah, and from Noah came everyone, which means that from Seth came you. The forgotten son is the ancestor of all the living. The quiet thread is the one that did not break, And so as the night comes down, let one image stay with you, not a tower, not a sea, but a light. Picture a single small flame, a lamp or a candle being carried down a long dark corridor. The corridor is so long that you cannot see either end of it. It stretches back into a darkness older than memory, and forward into a darkness no one has yet entered. And down that corridor, hand to hand, the little flame is passed. One figure carries it a while, walking through the dark. And then before that figure fades into the shadow, the flame is passed to another, who carries it a while further, and then to another, and another. Down and down the endless corridor, the small light, moving steadily forward through the immense and patient dark. Some of the figures who carry it are famous, and most are not. Most are utterly forgotten, their names lost, their faces gone, everything about them erased except this one thing, that the flame was in their hands for a while, and they did not let it go out, and they passed it on. That corridor is the line of Seth. That corridor is the long descent of the generations that runs from the third son of the first family all the way down to you. And the flame is the thread, the promise, the faith, the calling on the name, the light that the faithful kept burning through the long night of the world simply by handing it on. And here is the thing to see. The thing that should steady you as you watch that small light move down the corridor of the ages. It never goes out. That is the whole astonishment of the story. Across all those generations, through all that darkness, past the murder in the field and the exile into Nod, past the long refrain of death tolling through the centuries, past the great seduction that nearly dissolved the Holy Line into the world, past the flood that drowned everything else, the little flame never once goes dark. It gutters sometimes. It narrows down more than once to a single trembling point carried by a single pair of hands, when it seems the next breath of wind will surely put it out. But it does not go out. It comes down the corridor unbroken through the appointed seed, through the praying son, through the man who walked with God and was taken, through the one who found favor and rode the ark across the waters, through generation after forgotten generation, and it is still burning. And the hands that carry it now are in the end your own. The flame that was lit in the shadow of the first grave is the same flame that burns low and steady in your keeping tonight. It never went out. It came all the way down to you. And here is the quiet comfort the whole story has been carrying toward you. The rest it wants to lay in your hands as the day ends. You do not have to be Cain. You do not have to build the city or forge the blade or make the great brilliant mark upon the world that the line of achievement is forever straining after. And you do not have to be Abel, the tragic one, the one whose story is dramatic enough to be remembered. It is enough. Receive the light from the hands that came before you, and to carry it quietly through your own stretch of the dark, and to pass it on before you fade to the hands that come after. That is not a small life. That is not a forgotten life in the way that matters. That is the very life through which everything is carried forward. The whole human story survived on exactly that, on the quiet faithfulness of unremembered people who simply kept the flame and handed it on. And your life, however ordinary it feels, however little the world may remember it, can be exactly that, a link that holds, a hand that does not drop the light, a faithful stretch of the long corridor down which the flame is carried home. Think of how much of your own life is already this, already the quiet carrying on that the world does not notice and does not reward. The ordinary faithfulness of getting up each day and doing what love and duty ask of you. The patient raising of children who will not remember half of what you gave them. The care for aging parents. The keeping of small promises. The showing up again and again for people and tasks that will never make you famous. The handing on to whoever comes after you of whatever light you were given, a faith, a kindness, a way of being in the world, a name. None of it makes the history books. All of it is the line of Seth. All of it is the flame passed quietly down the corridor of the generations by hands the world forgets. And the story you have heard tonight is the assurance that this quiet faithfulness is not the lesser thing. It so often feels like that. It is in fact the very thing the whole future has always depended on. The thread that does not break, the carrying that brings the light home. So let the striving to be Cain go quiet tonight. Let the longing to be famous, to be brilliant, to build the monument and make the name and be remembered by the world. Let it rest. You were not made to be a pillar of stone inscribed against the end of the world, struggling to make your wisdom outlast you. You were made to be a living thing carrying a living flame for a little while faithfully, and then to lay it down in another's hands and rest. The pillars crumble, the cities fall, the brilliant lines are swept away, but the flame passed hand to hand by the quiet, and the faithful comes down the corridor unbroken age after age, and it is still burning, and it has reached even you. Rest now then, in the company of the forgotten Son. Rest in the long line of the quiet faithful, the ones who called on the name and walked with God, and carried the thread through the dark without anyone watching. You are one of them. The light is in your hands for a while. You do not have to make it brighter than it is, or carry it further than your strength allows, or be remembered for having held it. You have only to keep it gently through your own stretch of the night, and trust that the hands that came before you, and the hands that will come after you, are part of the same unbroken carrying, the same long faithfulness, the same flame moving home through the dark toward the morning where the oil of mercy is finally poured out and the garden is opened again at last. And if as you lie there in the quiet, the old fear comes, the fear of being forgotten, the fear that your small and ordinary life will leave no mark, the fear that the world will close over your name as the waters closed over the world of the flood. Then let the forgotten son be your comfort, for Seth was forgotten too. Almost no one remembers his name. And yet he is the ancestor of everyone alive, the carrier of the promise, the link through which the whole human story passed. Being forgotten by the world did not make him unimportant to the story. It is the same for you. The world's memory is not the measure of a life. The faithful carrying is the measure, the keeping of the flame, the handing on, the quiet love that asks no monument, and that you can do tonight and tomorrow and for all your ordinary days. And it will be enough and more than enough, and the thread will come down through you unbroken, just as it came down through the forgotten son to you. The seed did not break. It came down to you, and tonight you may simply hold it and be still, and let the long corridor of the faithful keep its quiet watch around you, as the flame burns low it and steady, and the dark grows gentle, and you,